Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Henk and Tertius.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It sounds quite impressive when it's read like that. So yes, today we'll talk about navigating through the storm. Get your ship in order. We will basically cover what we term the storm. We'll have a quick look at some supply chain trends that we are seeing and that we've heard quite a bit about during the other sessions. We'll then dive into a section on project evidence where we explore the kind of work we've been doing with our customers for the last 18 months. We'll give some advice on navigating through this thing we call the storm. We'll talk about the silver lining, and then we'll take some questions and answers if there are any. Right, so what is the storm we are talking about? Well, basically, it is the prevailing global and local economic climate. Continued low growth prospects and rising costs, and increasing political and economic instability. And I think the question of the day is, what can we do from a supply chain perspective to keep our businesses from running adrift or even sinking in these challenging times? So more on the storm, we see the risk of business interruption, including supply chain disruption, increasing. There's a general move away from just traditional damage-driven events, such as fire or natural disaster, to non-damage events, such as cyber incidents or political instability or even terrorism. And the impact of these geopolitical instabilities are far-reaching. So where were we? We were saying that the backlash from these recent geopolitical instability, has led to increasing protectionism, anti-globalization, and changing legal and political environments, really affecting global trade and the way the world does business. Global GDP has been around the 3.1 to 3.4% mark for the last 3 years. And in effect, the global economic recovery is slower than has been expected. And it's not been helped by the UK vote in favor of leaving the European Union or the weaker than expected growth in the US. Vulnerabilities are further compounded both for emerging and advanced economies due to the slowing growth in China, a strengthening US currency amidst weakening emerging market currencies, and sustained low prices for commodities such as oil. No wonder that in one survey, it suggests that only 35% of global CEOs believe that revenues are set to increase in the near term. When it comes to Africa, most people agree that Africa remains a territory, or the only territory, possibly with significant growth potential. The problem with Africa is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Africa is a tough place to do business with huge barriers to entry, and it's very politically unstable. The sharp declines in oil prices and mineral prices are obviously not a good thing, because that is typically what organizations come to Africa for. So all of a sudden, given the high barriers to entry and the low potential return, these long-term, high-value investments are not looking so promising. When it comes to South Africa, the picture, as we know, is no better. We've felt the effects of a tightening US monetary policy. We've got unprecedented levels of political instability. The Chinese slowdown has also affected our exports along with low commodity prices. We've seen massive exchange rate fluctuations. We've been on the back of rising interest rates. We've been downgraded from a credit perspective. And we heard today, although the forecast for our GDP growth was 1%, we've just found out that it's actually 0.7%, and apparently we're in technical recession. So really not a good picture. And essentially, it's said that although businesses are making more money, costs are accelerating faster. So the bottom line is, companies' bottom lines are under severe pressure. And businesses are forced to look at new and innovative ways to find value. So given these challenges, we believe that you have to look towards your supply chain. All right, so let's look at some of the supply chain trends that we've researched and we felt are appropriate to mention today. The first trend, and probably the most pervasive trend, and the trend that belies all the other trends, is that of technology. It's hard to have a discussion around supply chain or business improvement without referencing some technology, whether this be ERP or warehouse management system or transportation management system or some planning solution. Technology is basically always spoken about. And I think it's fair to say that companies will continue to pursue the right technologies that will allow them to better plan, execute, and optimize their supply chains. The emergence of cloud-based architectures have also made technology more accessible of late, and has also made the prospect of interfacing or integrating with trading partners far more feasible. The next trend we want to speak about is data and analytics. As technology footprints mature and as businesses become more connected, more and more data is being captured. We see companies are investing heavily into the capabilities and the skills that will allow them to analyze this data, to understand the customer data, to understand their cost to serve data, to look for trends, to look for places where they can optimize their business. I think it's fair to say that companies that get this right will certainly outperform those companies that lag the trend in this regard. The next trend is supply chain collaboration. Supply chain collaboration is not a new thing. We know it's been touted as the holy grail to unlocking potential value in the supply chain for a long time. We do, however, see a change in supply chain collaboration. Integrated business planning is now starting to transcend the boundaries of the organization, including suppliers, customers, and even service providers. And it is doing so because there's technology that is enabling it, which we'll get to in a minute. So the bottom line still remains that sharing the right information between trading partners and taking collective decision still holds value for these trading partners. Which brings us to supply chain control towers. The drive for visibility and the ability to collaborate with value chain partners has given rise to supply chain control towers. Supply chain control towers are technology solutions that effectively connect all trading partners in an extended supply chain network, sharing real-time data such as demand, inventory position, and even available transport capacity. This has far-reaching consequences, as you now replace a lot of the traditional forecast-based or rules-based replenishment requirements. And the system can simultaneously facilitate planning and execution, propagating or sending optimal inventory parcels to the network with the lowest carrier on that specific route. So the combined value proposition is therefore lower total cost of ownership as well as optimal network stocks. Very powerful stuff. The next trend we talk about is adaptive supply chains. So real-time demand insights and demand shaping capabilities is what has given rise to adaptive supply chains. Here we think about typically supply chains such as e-tailing supply chains, especially large e-tailing supply chains, where you have massive consumer bases interacting electronically with businesses. And as those consumers log on, those electronic interfaces know those consumers, and they are instantly able, based on past order history or searches, they will start shaping demand and pushing specific products to those consumers, tying slow movers at discounted rates with a multitude of shipping options. So apart from that clever technology, these orders have to be planned very rapidly for execution. And then they are handed over to very competent, very flexible supply chains to execute. These supply chains have to have stock in the right places, have to be configured correctly, and because it's such a dynamic market, these supply chains are continuously reviewed and reconfigured to make sure they are able to execute on this dynamic demand. Another trend we see is effectively a consumer trend, omni-channel logistics. We've seen consumer behavior changing. In the past, consumers might have only bought as they've gone to a store. These days, consumers might like to go to a store, look at the product, feel the product, compare products, but prefer to go home and rather do the purchase online after they've researched some more. Conversely, they might want to research online and identify the store with the right product, and then they will go to the store and purchase there. Essentially, retailers will have to transform and allow them to interact with their consumers across these different channels so that they keep their share of their demand. So the last trend we want to talk about is that of sustainability, or the drive for sustainability that is becoming more entrenched in the way businesses are doing, or the world operates. Sustainability has gone from a sort of a compliance mindset to something that is becoming more centered to the business, something with real brand equity or order-winning potential. So businesses are more concerned with the triple bottom line, being social, environment, and economic. and the drive for sustainability and the elimination of waste is high on the strategic agenda, and it will be on the strategic agenda going forward. All right, so those are the trends. I'm now going to hand over to Henk to take us through the project evidence base. Thanks, Henk.
Thank you, Tertius. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get into looking at what South African businesses are doing from a supply chain project perspective, what I've done is just to first establish a framework in order for us to map all these trends that Tertius has just discussed, as well as then map all the trends that we see from the project evidence to make a comparison. Very well-known framework is, of course, the SCORE model. So you have your suppliers on the one side and your customers and market on the other. You have all your supply chain functions in between: source, make, store, deliver and return, and then sales and marketing. And then, of course, we have people, process, and technology to enable these different functions. So on the very first level, you have operations planning. So that's typically a backwards flow in your supply chain, where you start with predicting demand with some sort of forecasting under the sales and marketing function. You do your DRP, or distribution requirements planning, your SRP, or storage requirements planning, production planning, and then, of course, your material requirements planning. After that's the physical execution of the supply chain. So that's where we buy the raw material, we make the stuff, we store the finished product, we transport it to our customer, and we send them the invoice. And lastly, most businesses then measure the performance of the execution, right? So you have visibility and control layer there, and typically under sales and marketing, we measure customer service. So that's the in full component. We measure in time so that we deliver when we promised we will. We look at inventory, working capital, as well as the quality of the inventory in your supply chain. We also look at your plan versus actual production and waste in your manufacturing. And then lastly, obviously, supplier performance. All right, so if we establish this framework, what I've done there is to say, if we do anything across these different functions within your business, I've termed it tactical planning. So it's optimization across the different functions. And lastly, I've looked at strategic planning, meaning that that would span into your customer or into your supplier, hence beyond the boundaries of your own organization and supply chain. If you look at the economic influences, and Tertius has just discussed, and we've seen that we're now technically in a recession, that will definitely have an impact on the supply chain and what we can control. So we can't control the economic influences that happens, but certainly if you look at that, it will have an impact on both our suppliers and the market. With less disposable income on the market side, we can expect things to be different. I've also highlighted people. So if you're in a business that's unionized, you look at labor unrest or strikes, that will certainly also be external impact. So everything here with a red boundary around it indicates all the external influences on your supply chain and what we should do with it. So if you look at the trends that Tertius discussed, what I've done then is to say, but where does it fit on this framework? So firstly, technology, as we know, is an enabler, could sit within a specific function like a WMS or a TMS, but certainly in the context of this is also spanning beyond the boundaries of your own organization. The second one was data and analytics. I think the intent of data and analytics in this instance was to really understand the market and what your customer wants. So I've plotted there under visibility and control with the influence over the market. Secondly, and next to each other is collaboration, and then control towers. So control towers enabling the planning and collaboration between the different supply chain partners in the value chain. Adaptive supply chains, being able to adapt to different changes in the market or in your suppliers. How do you react to that? Omnichannel, as we've heard, people is buying differently these days, online shopping, comparing. So how do we react from a supply chain perspective to that? And then lastly, sustainability. I put that under people. For me, that's a strong link to also retain our skills internally in the organization. And there's a strong perspective of the market looking into the business, saying, but what is your sustainability and how does that look from a brand perspective? I think what's key about this picture is that you will notice that it partially or fully actually integrate across all these red blocks, meaning it all actually has an external influence beyond our internal supply chain that we look at. So if you look at the project evidence now, I've looked at 104 projects over the last 18 months. It's in 12 industries and 42 sub-industries, your typical FMCG, logistics, retail, and finance environment. And it was representative of South African businesses, really big and medium enterprises. If we then take all those projects and overlay it on this framework, 10% of those projects focus on the source and make function. 12% on the store function, a mere 5% looking at the sales and marketing. So that was quite shocking for me to see that that's the amount of focus there is to understand the market. And then 37% looking at the deliver and return function. The significance of this is that 64% of all projects was still based on a silo or a division within the supply chain. And if you think about what we've heard about collaboration and breaking down the silos, and we've learned that and we've heard that at SABIX before, it's interesting to see that almost 2/3 of projects is still very silo-based in optimizing specific functions. 29% was on the tactical level, so that's at least great to see that businesses within their own boundaries are trying to optimize between the different functions, and then only 7% looked at integration or optimization beyond the boundaries of your own supply chain. There was only 3 examples of that, being in the retail, petrochemical, and the other one was financial industries. So in summary, if you look at it again, 64% to improve current silo operations, 29% on a tactical level, so that's cross-functional, and only 7% on a strategic level. 37% of the project focused on the delivery and return function, followed by store at 12%. This is not really surprising. If you look at outbound logistics, typically for a business, more than 55% of outbound logistics sits in transport, so the cost is really high. 15% in warehousing, another 15% sit in your inventory, and then 13% for overheads and admin. I've also seen the World Bank yesterday said that they expect the oil price to actually increase by 24% this year. So it will be interesting to see how companies react to that, and I would expect even more focus on this. So if you look at the purpose of the projects, 46% was to reduce costs. So that was the aim of the project, was to reduce cost and be more efficient. 18% to improve visibility across the supply chain, 30% for process efficiency, and I would guess most of that was also actually to drive out cost, being more efficient in terms of how you do your processes, and only 6% on technology advancement. So if you think about where technology can take us today, how prevalent that is in our industry, if you listen to the keynote address yesterday morning, I think it's concerning to see that only 6% was really to look at technology advancements. So key observations of the project evidence is that cost reduction was the key focus rather than strategic ventures. The majority of the projects are short-term initiatives aimed at protecting the bottom line, with only a small percentage of businesses looking to actively drive innovation. Generally, companies are risk-averse and in survival mode. So if we accept that the demand is not there with a retracting economy, for us to protect the bottom line, what should we do? We should focus on cost and reduce cost, and you can clearly see that from the different projects. Alignment within the organization in terms of people, it was evident that managers are very operationally focused still. Typical sort of comments we've seen is we don't have time to look at tactical and strategic, and I think that's also a message that people is really driving out cost at the moment to survive. We've seen a disconnect between middle management and top management in terms of the agenda of supply chains. Management very often wants innovation, but the basics is not in place. And then lastly, change management is essential, and I think it's still being neglected in order for us to successfully implement projects in our environment. Then technology and systems. It's best to understand your needs correctly to avoid expensive mistakes. You have to understand why you implement or doing something from a technology or systems perspective. You should remember that systems don't fix physical problems. I think Very often people throw technology to a problem, but that's not always the best case. Then data quality, and specifically master data, is vital. We still see that data quality very often is very poor. I mean, that's very important for us to integrate systems between businesses and get the specialist skills in order to help you with this stuff. Then the true cost of doing business. We still see that organizations don't understand what is driving supply chain cost in the business. And something very simple like a cost to serve can identify the improvement initiatives and can certainly also add into your planning processes. And it's very valuable information that you can gain from that. So how do we navigate through the storm? South African businesses are inwardly focused based on the project evidence I've just shown you, with a strong emphasis to reduce cost. Driving the efficiency or reducing cost in itself isn't wrong. However, I think we're missing the sight of the horizon going forward. So it's quite blurry. And I mean, if this is the reality for you in your business, I mean, the question is then, how do we move forward? What are the type of projects that we should be doing, and what's the sequence of these projects? I mean, the idea is that we get a clear sort of visibility of the horizon, what it looks like in order for us to drive the supply chain in the right direction. Firstly, the thing we should do is to get the basics right. I mean, we've said that many times before, but I mean, there's still very often a misalignment between the vision of the company in terms of the business strategy and the supply chain. And how do we design that supply chain in order to support the business vision and strategy? So we have to define what the supply chain needs to be good at and prioritize the supply chain objectives accordingly. Whether it's a responsive supply chain, an agile, a low cost, or doesn't matter what the objective is, but the design looks different, and we need to understand what that looks like. Typical, very practical initiatives is, for example, a network design. I mean, we have to continuously define what the network should look like based on what we think the market is doing and based on our supplier footprint. That is closely coupled with inventory design and transport modeling. Inventory is that buffer. It's still necessary. It creates that buffer between the uncertainty between demand and supply, as well as for any unforeseen risks in the supply chain or spikes in demand or whatever. But we have to make sure that we keep the right stock in the right place. Transport modeling, what is the fleet capability that we require? What is the mix of fleet, the composition thereof, in order for us to service our customers? Then process and operations improvement. So that's the day-to-day running of your business. And simple methodologies like total quality management, Lean Six Sigma, all that stuff comes to mind. And we have to keep on focusing on doing the right things. Then cost to serve, or total cost of ownership. That's really valuable, powerful information that we can use to understand which customers or products is actually positively contributing to your bottom line. And that will also inform the route to market in order to cost effectively service your customers. I want to show you a quick example of a very simple dashboard. And it's a holistic view of all the outbound logistics activities. So you don't have to look at the detail, but on the top you can see for a certain period what was your total logistics cost or your cost to serve. What does that translate if we translate that into a percentage of value? How many units did we deliver? What's the rand per unit then? What is my service level, and how much inventory do I have on hand? We've also broken that down into the different supply chain activities, so you can measure that quite clearly. You've seen all your different distribution centers, as well as the percentage of sales for your different distribution centers. And down below is just a balancing act where we try to make sure that we balance back to the income statement to make sure that we don't miss any costs. Also, another example of where is my inventory in my network. Understanding where is my biggest inventory being held, at which depots. If you have different business units, how many pallets do you have, for example? Where does that sit? And you can see a breakdown of each of those. But more importantly, for me, it's a barometer of how healthy your supply chain is, right? So if you measure quality of your inventory, it's a very good indication of where is obsolete stock, where should I improve, or where is out of stock, and you can react accordingly. And then lastly, this picture you can do for products or customers, understanding which customers is really your big customers and where they sit in terms of a cost to serve based on the sales value. these are the customers you want to go and focus on. So they're quite small in terms of volume in your life, but they're quite expensive, and that's where we want to focus and improve on. So very simple dashboards. You can do that real time, and you can see that immediately, and you can make the right decisions. So as supply chain leaders, we all would like to know, but beyond the basic, what should we do? So we need to strategically advance our businesses, and Tertius has also discussed the integrated business planning, which is the synchronization between demand and all supply elements, whether it's procurement or production, doesn't matter, but that's something we still need to get right. Performance analytics is using technology to understand what happened, why did it happen, what's going to happen, and what should I do. And I believe that organizations that are able to assimilate improvement requirements deduced from data analytics will outperform those who can't. So it's really important that we use data to inform our decisions. Visibility, I think it speaks for itself within your organization, cross-functional visibility, but also into your customers and into your suppliers to understand what's going on, and then also control towers that assist us to collect this data and automate the planning processes to some extent. So organizations must become information-centric in understanding where value is made and destroyed to ensure that when the storm has passed, they are growing purposefully in a value-adding manner. It's really, really important. So in conclusion, ensure that you have a strategy that's well bedded down before you make long-term decisions. Don't neglect change management. It's still something that I see very often being neglected, and that's crucial for successful implementations of projects. We need to get the basics and the sequence right. First, look at the physical environment in terms of network and people, followed by processes and systems or technology. And use technology and data, and get the specialist skills to support you, and it will assist you to make the right decisions in your business. We have to involve operational people, but the drive is strategic. So although we have a day-to-day running of our businesses, I think the intent should always be that we have a bigger horizon going forward, and we all need to be clear on where are we heading on the ship, on the sea. You can't jump the gun on cost removal. You need to follow the sequence to make it effective, cost of ownership, market dynamics, and then understand the cost reduction strategy before you just go in and start cutting out costs. Then have a clear improvement roadmap, articulate your strategy and what you currently have, understand the full capability of what you have and exploit that first, and then step change into the next level. Handing back to Tertius for the last slide.
Thank you very much, Henk, for that summary. I think, just to conclude, I think given the doom and gloom of a global economy, it's tempting to default into a holding pattern and to batten down the hatches and just merely wish and wait for better times. I think the truth is that economic cycles are a reality. And although we've been waiting for some time and probably will wait for some time more, there will at some point be a reversal or a recovery in the economy. And there will again be opportunity and expansion. And we believe that the real winners will be those ones that have done the hard yards during the tough times. So our message is therefore that you focus on the right to-do list, the right mix of short-term and long-term focused projects to enable you to instill the capabilities you require to go next level when this tide eventually turns. We thank you very much for your attendance today, and if you'd like to ask questions, we're available.